So what I'm going to do, and I can go now much more quickly because they're all pictures now in the second and the third part, is to look at some of the things that we've done. But what I wanted to do is try and lay out why we would do these things. Yeah? Why on earth would you try and reform a modern art museum in a small town in the Netherlands? You know? But it is, I think, in places like that, sometimes that certain things can happen. And it's trying to allow that to happen, which is what we've been trying to do. I hope that some of these things also ring bells with certain things that, you know, I've had long discussions with Vasif over the many years that we've known each other, and there are some things that are also, as I say, fed in from discussions that we've had, and some things that might be familiar also from certain things that are happening here or also in South Galata in the future. This is a project called the Living Archive, which was really to look at the history of the museum and try to have in the museum the presence of its own history all the time, rewritten for the moment. So you'll see that there are always often two dates here. This is a reconstruction, and this is when it was relatively traditional still, of an exhibition from 1969, made in 2005. An important exhibition called The Street, by the only exhibition in Van Abbe ever which included absolutely no art. It was an exhibition which was, I think, an early attempt, a sort of early magician de la terre maybe even, an attempt to make an exhibition which tried to look at the street as a global phenomenon. So there were sections from Indonesia, from Sao Paulo or Rio, from London, from Moscow, from Beijing, in this exhibition. But it was interesting that in '69, in order to do that, in order to try and speak about a phenomenon of the world, what you had to do was to exclude art entirely, or the artist ran away at that time. This is another very obvious exhibition which just goes through each of the year, relating it, and I think these histories are quite interesting to come back to. The history of the world, if you like, at least the European part of it, the history of art at the time, and the history of the institution, and see how these sometimes merge but often fall way apart. So in 1937, you have Guernica, the German bombing of Guernica, it's all in Dutch, sorry. You have the Eindhoven'daki Kunst, the decadent art exhibition, the Nazi exhibition which defined National Socialist aesthetics as being classical and not modern. And you had then in the museum, you had a contemporary Belgian painting and sculpture exhibition. So you see how these things sort of, you know, completely diverge. And sometimes they come together. Then, and this was a struggle in the museum, for instance, just to tell you about those traditions that need to be wrested from the conformism that seeks to overpower them. We finally were able in these small living archives to put artworks. Initially everybody in the museum was opposed to it because you can't mix artworks and archives because the artwork is holy treasure. But here is a work by Immendorf, and this is an exhibition which looks at activism and conflicts in the museum. Those moments where the directors or artists clashed with each other or with the political powers that be. This is, for instance, there's a letter here from Hans Hacker where he says that if Rudy Fuchs, who was the director at the time, started to collect Anselm Kiefer, then he wanted nothing to do with the Van Abbe Museum because Anselm Kiefer was a fascist artist. And so this stuff was sitting in the archives, never really uncovered, and it was really nice to open it up. And then, of course, this work was bought by Rudy Fuchs, which is a Brecht cycle by Immendorf, directly political in a way, which is called Where Do You Stand, Colleague? A direct address to the sort of political position of artists, but done in a form which Hacker would, at the time, have been resistant to because it was a return to painting. We also made small exhibitions, one-room exhibitions, where we invited a number of voices from outside of the staff of the museum to curate and really discovered certain insights. So here, for instance, I think is one of the most successful ones. This is the collection as a community, like unavowed community, it's called, it's a Blanchot term. It's like the community that doesn't realize it's a community, that just happens to sort of live together. And this is the parts of the drawing collection. And actually this wall, you can't really see it, but it's built at an angle, so that the works themselves hang loose from the wall and cast a shadow. And this shadow is very important because opposite this is this work by Dan Flavin, which is a classic modernist work, but functions as the lighting for this. Yeah? So you have this direct relationship, also in terms of the tool, if you like, of the lighting, between this sort of heterogeneous collection which is put together by a young Korean curator and this modernist, precise modernist organization. Another exhibition which tried to shift the sort of curatorial voice was the Kite Depot, where people would be invited to ask for a work from the collection through looking through photographs of the collection, and then within a week or 2 weeks it would become on show in this method. The only condition that they would have to fulfill is that they would have to write about a paragraph of motivation, of the reason why they would want this work. And so this also then became, and has become, part of the archive of the museum. So something like 450 works were chosen in the period of 2.5, 3 years that we did this. And now we have these personal narratives about why these works are important. Of course, some of them are just, I like the color, or I remember it as a kid. But some are very precise analysis. And you see the richness, we all know this from Facebook or whatever, the richness of once you throw something out, a question out to people, then the richness of the replies, which could never be predicted. And then a project which is also in the collection, the Museum of American Art in Berlin, which tries, I think, to directly address this question of the end of modernity by forging together what you see here on the left are paintings from the Vatican and from what he would say, the Museum of American Art would say, would be the first museum, the Belvedere in the Vatican collection, said to be the first museum when in the very early 17th century Pope Julius II gathered all these sculptures from around Rome that were basically sitting in corners and decaying, and brought them to the Vatican and displayed them in a museum. The first time that somebody gave value to this non-Christian stuff. Yeah? It had been sitting there for 500 years, or 400 years we could say, being completely devalued because it was pagan, so it was actually dangerous. Yeah? You wouldn't want to go near it. And he brought them together, and there we have Apollo Belvedere in these sort of famous works. And he puts this, in a sense, museum at the beginning of what he would say is modernity. He puts it much further back than the French Revolution, and that makes sense to some extent. And he puts this opposite the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and he calls them both museums of antiquities. So what happens, what's rather beautiful, if you think about Magician de la Terre and ethnography, he turns the Museum of Modern Art into a museum of antiquity of a certain culture. So he turns the Museum of Modern Art into a museum of ethnography. He does the opposite. And so these can all be copied. Because of course in ethnography it doesn't matter whether it's real or copied in many senses. So these are all copies of works. So you have Mondrian or you have Malevich, and you have Alfred Barr, the founder, like Pope Julius, of the Museum of Modern Art. And this is the Museum of Modern Art below, and paintings in black and white from the Vatican. So coming back to that quote about in every era the attempt must be made to wrest tradition away from the conformism that is about to overpower it. I think in many cases what we've tried to do is to think about the ideas of repetition, of reconstruction, and what I'll call repristinization. Pristinization means something which is completely new, yeah, pristine, untouched. And how could you repristinization is to make something untouched again, but knowing that it's been touched, because it's repristinization. You're not pretending, it's like refurbishing a car, yeah? You don't pretend that the car is new, but you try to make it as new as possible. Yeah? So repristinization will be to try and make it new in order to achieve this Benjamin quote of wresting tradition away from the conformism which is about to overpower it. And I'll just go through a few examples of this. I won't link them so directly because I hope you can read it. We repeated, unfortunately I don't have a slide of the original exhibition, but we repeated an exhibition in 2009 which had been made in 1983, exactly, with the same curator, Ruby Fuchs, invited to make the same exhibition. Of course, immediately he wanted to do things differently, immediately he was ashamed of certain things that he'd done, all those things. But we tried to keep him in control. We didn't quite succeed, but almost. But basically this idea, which of course the collection provides, yeah, collection, the treasure chest, provides this possibility to replay history. But of course, as soon as you replay history, you re-pristinize, you make as though new, you also know that it's not anymore new. Because these radical juxtapositions, Picasso with Sol LeWitt are no longer radical juxtapositions. They're kind of the things that happen in every modern art museum throughout the world. Here you have Brotas, Cunelis, and Onkawara, quite traditional. And there's a few others, I cut the slides. I wanted to refer back to our exhibition in 2005 because this is a work that we bought. And it again thinks about repristinization, or how you recontextualize. This was in Tutendepozu, in Depot now it's called, right at the top, for those of you that might remember all that long time ago. This was a work by Pavel Buchler. And it consisted of speakers speaking a text by Kafka, which is the moment in Kafka when Joseph K. discovers that he's going to get nowhere in the village. And they say, you are not from the village, you are not from the castle, you are nobody. In fact, you are worse than nobody, you're a stranger. And this is the text, it's slightly longer than that, but that's the content, which plays over and over again in a computer voice. And then we thought, okay, how do we do it in the museum? And what we did, because this is obviously the best version, yeah, it will never be as good as this, we have to admit, but we need some context for it. It would be absurd to present it in a white cube as though the white cube was this, as though that history which is in this building could be possibly reproduced in this ridiculous notion of neutrality which the white cube represents. So what we did is, together with the artists, we showed it with some of the classical modernist works that come from around the same time as Kafka is writing. And what happened is this computer voice, this sort of tinny sound which comes through these rather poor quality speakers, it reintroduced a kind of alienation in these paintings, which has simply been lost. And when I come back to Picasso in Palestine, I'll also talk about that. Yeah? The meaning of these paintings, the way that these paintings were so crudely violent, in a sense, towards people's idea of perception at the time, yet fracturing the face, destroying, breaking up the field that you would understand as an identifiable picture with identifiable perspective. That violence has gone. I mean, we're used to fracturing all the time. You know, we look at a screen and it's fractured into 20 different elements. We take it for granted. But that was, at that time, a harsh moment. And this harshness of the sound brought in a tiny way. Yeah? But what happened is that people who usually come to the museum and are very happy that we show the classical work complained. You know, they said, oh, we can't see the classical work because there's this music. Well, this voice going on in the background. And I thought, yeah, finally the classical works become a subject where people actually engage with. They don't just go along and go, oh yeah, Picasso, oh yeah, Delaunay, oh yeah, Braque. Yeah? But they go actually, oh, that's a Picasso, I want to see it. I want to see it in its normal holy shrine, yeah, in its treasure chest mode, and I can't do that anymore, so I get angry. But anger actually is healthy, although it's provocative.